I select the games to be reviewed on this channel based on if I can acquire them. I have an extensive collection, so this wasn't a problem at first. That's why you see Street Fighter and the Star Wars D6 as some of the first games I reviewed. Others I get through used bookstores when I'm trying to find obscure and cheap titles, resulting in some of the more lesser-known titles I've reviewed, like Tephra or It Came from the Late 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 Show. Sometimes people will either give me a copy of a book or buy me a copy of a book. In one case, and though it's typically a PDF, that's where Star Frontiers and Traveler came from. But for this review, I was loaned a very special game by a friend that I had no idea was a Frank Herbert fan. He instructed me to do the review, then return the book immediately and intact, or else his wife would kill me with a Gom Jabbar. Today I have the privilege of reviewing one of the rarest RPGs ever made, Last Unicorn Games' Dune, Chronicles of the Imperium. This is the book that sells on the second-hand market for about a month's pay, so no pressure. I'm Mr. Welch, and I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. There's something about the Dune universe that inspires game designers. Dune 2 Battle for Arrakis is largely considered the first real-time strategy video game. The Dune board game by Avalon Hill commands hundreds of dollars on the second-hand market. It's considered one of the best political board games ever created. I once acquired an unpunched version, and when I decided to sell it, I paid my rent with it. The gentleman that bought it asked me if I could ship it priority overnight, and I told him only if he paid for it. He had me ship it to Amsterdam. So it's no surprise that the Dune role-playing game is borderline legendary in tabletop circles. Last Unicorn never actually printed the book themselves. The Herbert estate loves its licenses, and they demanded more money to approve the publication. Wizards of the Coast came in, bought Last Unicorn, and part of the agreement was they had to publish the Dune RPG. So they made exactly 3,000 copies. Sold them almost all exclusively at Gen Con 33, though a few were sold at smaller conventions overseas. Then Wizards lost the license. This book typically sells for 4 figures on auction sites. That's not what the sellers think this book is worth. That's what the buyers think this book is worth. There's no other way to legally acquire a copy. There's no PDF for sale. There was never a second printing. You either got this book for $35 at Gen Con or one of the overseas conventions, or you bought it secondhand for over $1,000. This book is worth its weight in melange. The book comes in at 286 pages full color. Dune was written by Owen Saylor, Christian Moore, and Matt Colville. Yes, the same Matt Colville of D&D running the game YouTube fame. Mark Zug did the cover art, and the interior illustrations were handled by over a dozen different artists. It goes without saying that this book is a one-book wonder. Quite possibly the most famous one-book wonder of role-playing games. Last Unicorn ran out of money in 2000, so Wizards picked up the line, and the rest is history. Dune became the mythical RPG, something that people talked about but few ever actually saw. Dune fans are loyal, but they are rarely fanatical. They don't have conventions or parties devoted to the setting like other fan bases do. That still doesn't explain how I got sorted into House Harkonnen at my friend's Harry Potter-themed birthday party. Everybody's running around outside on broomsticks. I'm floating around the living room in a black leather happy harness. At least they left the spice cabinet unguarded. The game is set at an indeterminate time before the start of the books during the rule of House Harkonnen over Arrakis. The history of Dune is vast and complicated, but let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up. In the distant future, a system of worlds is created and led by the various great houses. These houses become fantastically wealthy and irredeemably corrupt because of the advanced technology that was available to them. This decadence often came at the expense of the poor and less fortunate who were ruled over by the houses. Finally, the people had enough and rose up to throw down their masters. There's a few versions of the actual revolt described by various writers, the Butlerian Jihad, but in the end all thinking machines were banned along with quite a bit of similar technology. This signals the rise of House Carino and the start of the Great Imperium. Because of the prohibition on machines, mankind turns to perfecting the human mind. The Dune universe is filled with countless cults, political conspiracies, and secret cabals, all devoted to shaping the future of humanity. The Bene Gesserit Sisterhood focuses on breeding leaders of humanity to ensure future stability of the Imperium. The Spacers Guild controls interstellar commerce, and as such are only concerned with maintaining the flow of goods and the acquisition of the spice melange, which enables faster-than-light travel. The Chome Corporation handles the creation and distribution of most materials in the Imperium. It is largely controlled by the Imperial House Carino, but it also has shares that are owned by the various greater and lower houses, as well as the Bene Gesserit. The number of factions in the Dune universe would take hours to explain, including the near-heretical technology of the Ixians, the dreaded but strangely barely in this book Imperial Sardaukar, and many of the greater houses that were featured heavily in later novels like the Talaxu. The problem with Dune is you can't put everything in the setting that the players would expect into a single book. Remember, the first Dune movie just included the original book, and uncut it was 4 hours long. The rumored 6-hour movie is an urban legend. David Lynch confirmed that the remaining 2 hours was just redundant footage and that it would never have been included inside the actual movie. Just a random bit of Dune trivia because somebody else is going to bring it up if I don't. The Dune universe is just too massive to include in a single RPG book. Things had to get left out, which included, for some reason, the Fremen. In addition, the game is based around the books instead of the movies, so there's no heart plugs, there's no weirding units, there's no Sutter Carr running around in greenlit hazmat suits. Sadly, this means the dreaded Atreides battle pug unfortunately was left out of the book, which is a shame because it was obvious that this pug was genetically designed to protect the Duke and his family. Of course, now that you've seen the dreaded battle pug, you'll never be able to unsee it. Granted, a little-known fact about the cute little guy was during the Harkonnen attack, he accounted for nearly 24 Starter Car troopers before he escaped into the desert, where the Fremen say you can still hear its haunting battle yips as it hunts the sandworms for food. The mechanics of Dune is called the Icon system. It's a hybrid dice pool system where your skill levels actually add as a modifier to the final roll of the dice. It also throws in a wild die mechanic similar to Star Wars D6. You've got 5 attributes: physique, intelligence, coordination, charisma, and prescience. The last one concerns your character's psychic abilities, specifically the power of prophecy. Each attribute has 2 sub-characteristics, which can be a penalty or a bonus. When you have to make a test, you roll a number of dice equal to your attribute, adding or reducing the dice pool by your sub-characteristic if that's applicable. Then you add your skill level directly to the highest die rolled, and then you try to hit a target number. If you roll 6 higher than the target number, then you get the best result possible. If the wild die comes up a 6, then you also get to add the next highest die to the total. If the wild die rolls a 1, it's a catastrophic failure if any of the other dice in the test came up as a 1, otherwise it's ignored. Which is actually a good way to handle a wild die system for a D6 dice mechanic, because otherwise the critical failure roll is just 1 in 6, which is a little high for a critical failure. The system also makes heavy use of merits and flaws, as it's a very complicated social system, well, as befits one of the most comprehensive and political science fiction settings ever written. The merit system is also closely tied to the skill system, with 4 different types of skills based on the possible reputation of the character. Characters can be known for their valor, faith, intelligence, or leadership, and these different reputations have an actual impact on your traits and skills. Building a Dune character has a lot more steps than most RPGs, because just about every aspect you choose for your character later affects another aspect. Okay, you can admit it. Everyone knows this is how Sting steps out of the shower every single morning. You have to choose which house you will follow, which flavors your character's thinking and appearance. Then you select your vocation, which is your class. The vocation gives you a series of starting skills, traits, and disadvantages. And if a vocation assigns you a disadvantage at the start, you can never get rid of it. The disadvantage is part of your training. So the Bene Gesserit will always be duplicitous. Suk physicians will never be able to do anything to harm another person, unless tortured nearly to madness by the Harkonnens. And swordmasters are assigned a code of conduct based on their house. Once you've selected your vocation, this will give you a caste, which determines your place in the Imperial Society. This can be raised initially with some traits, but it's normally locked into place. There is no upward mobility in the Dune universe, with very few exceptions. Combat in Dune is fairly in-depth, with most combat being hand-to-hand because of the fact that shields are rather effective against ballistic weapons, and against energy weapons, well, that's a good way to restart the campaign. Las guns and shields don't work well together. There's actually a chart in the book that tells you how many miles across the mushroom cloud is going to be if you shoot a Holtzman shield with a las gun. So don't do that. Every player has a number of actions derived from their stats and a long list of things they can do with these actions. Combat in Dune is mostly dueling, and as such there's a lot of potential attacks and defenses that you can use. So one player can attack as an option, spend another option to parry an attack, and spend more options to use their offhand to attack again, and so on. You don't just roll to attack. The combat in Dune is smooth and it tells a story as 2 combatants are dancing around each other looking for an opening. One interesting aspect is if both of the players have the option to try something against each other and they tie, like initiative, or in the example given, both players going for a weapon at the same time, one can defer and allow the other one priority. The benefit this gives to the deferring character is it allows them a free reaction instead of having to use one of their options. For people looking to recreate the later books in the series, you're going to find yourself a bit disappointed with this RPG. This game was designed to recreate the lethal politics of the Dune setting. It doesn't focus on the events of the book. It doesn't even bring most of them up. Arrakis only gets a page and a half of mention. There's very little discussed about the Fremen, and the sandworms don't get a mention. You're not going to find rules for ornithopters in this book. Characters are meant to be the power players of their house. They will be traveling across the galaxy promoting the interests of their house or their guild or their organization. The book gives information on a variety of planets, but it lacks any guide to creating new worlds. Another aspect missing is hostile creatures. While sandworms are above the ability of any of the players, other alien creatures on different worlds would have been interesting to encounter. Dune is a human-centric universe. There are no intelligent aliens at all. You are meant to face the lethal horrors that is imperial politics. The downside is, because of the focus of that aspect of the setting, it can be difficult to have a party that comes from different houses, or even just be regular people. And Atreides is not going to share the same oxygen as a Harkonnen without an exceptional reason. The Dune universe is vastly different from just about any other science fiction universe out there, except for possibly Fading Suns, which took large chunks of Dune for inspiration. There are no great ship battles, as the Spacing Guild controls all FTL transport. You aren't going to see pirate raids or naval conflicts between the great houses. If a house gets out of line, the Spacing Guild cuts it off from the interstellar commerce, which is a death sentence in imperial politics. The Imperium has hard and fast rules against open warfare between the houses, putting a heavy emphasis on challenge and duels to resolve conflicts instead. Battles like the one that nearly destroyed House Atreides are almost unheard of. Players wanting to play as ace pilots or trigger-happy gun bunnies are going to be sorely disappointed on Arrakis. Dune was obviously not meant to be a standalone product. There's just too much background, there's too much history, there's too many characters to be captured in a book less than 300 pages. Last Unicorn had the rights to the card game, but when they wanted to do the RPG, the Herbert estate wanted more money. As I've said countless times before, never buy a games license, it rarely ends well. Wizards was able to do a single print run, but Wizards also has Hasbro cash. Most smaller game companies can only dream of that kind of money. After having said all of that, remember this review is rhetorical anyways, as this book is one of the most expensive RPG products on the secondhand market today. People aren't going to shell out over $1,000 for an RPG unless they are the ultimate Dune fanboy. There's no PDF on drive-thru, and the book will never be reprinted. There is a new Dune RPG about to hit shelves, but no matter how good it is, it will never live up to the hype that Chronicles of the Imperium became. Remember the old adage, I didn't want it until you told me I couldn't have it. That wraps up Dune Chronicles of the Imperium. Major kudos to Luke and Beth for loaning me their copy. I never knew he was that much of a Frank Herbert fan. Granted, he also bought this book back when it was $300 on the market, so there's that. While we wait for 2077 to hit the shelves, check out the next Mad Musings, where I'll be looking at another licensed product, the Red Dwarf RPG. Until then, smoke me a kipper. I'll be home for breakfast.